Well, the Russians fired a warning shot across the western bow this past week. Canada and the US and other Western nations are continuing to say they will do and send more, but it seems late, and the gruesome sight of bodies piling up continues. David Perry is the president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He teaches at the Center for Military and Strategic Studies, Calgary. He hosts a podcast on all matters defense called Defense Deconstructed. And he is joining us now because, David, welcome and thank you for giving us your time. When the Prime Minister announces that we are now sending heavy artillery to help Ukraine, my question is, what does that mean? Do you have any idea?
Well, just actually, thanks first for inviting me to come on and chat again. Looking forward to it. And I just saw the details out almost literally right before we started talking. And I guess it's going to mean 4 guns coming from the artillery unit in Manitoba and an unspecified amount of ammunition. So let's get some details on that. And it looks like it'll be the more modern M777 piece of artillery that we first started buying in the mid-2000s for Afghanistan.
And what about the LAVs, the light armored vehicles? Or have we made a decision?
If we have, we haven't gotten to the point of communicating that decision, so I haven't seen anything further on that.
I'm a little surprised because a couple of weeks ago, Anita Anand, the defense minister, said that we had exhausted our supplies. The cupboards were bare. We had sent grenades and some, other things, but we had nothing else. So does this mean we found more things, or we're actually purchasing things? How do we square those two things?
I think it's probably a combination of two things. I mean, I think what is happening on the ground in Ukraine has changed fairly significantly in the last several weeks. So the Russians have basically pulled out forces from the north, pulled it out from around the capital and surrounding areas. The conflict is now shifting basically predominantly towards the east, the region that's been contested for a number of years, which has a lot of different terrain. And Ukraine now, based on a whole bunch of things, the support they've gotten thus far, the change in what the Russians are doing, and the potential that with enough backing, they can potentially start to retake some of the territory, not just that Russia had taken since late February of this year, but maybe even some of the contested areas in the Donbass region that the Russians have been in for multiple years now. It seems as though the evolution of their needs is both dictated by what they think is possible to get from the West, now that the West very belatedly is really checking their inventory and doing so again, as is the case in Canada, but also the needs based on the evolving conflict have changed. So I imagine that they're part of the ask that it's actually changed. So they're asking for artillery now where they weren't before, as an example, or at least that hadn't been reported before. Same thing about the request for armored personnel carriers. I don't think that was part of the initial sort of basket of requests that was being made to Canada a few months ago. I think the other thing is, when you say that there's nothing else to do, there's always a bunch of implicit, I think, assumptions or pieces of context in there. Fundamentally, we could keep taking things out of the Canadian Army's inventory until it's all gone and sending it there if we want to. There's just obviously going to be a whole bunch of implications of doing that because our own troops won't have equipment.
No, I'm not saying at all that we should empty our own cupboards. It's just that there was nothing there and now there's something there. But I think your explanation is a good one, that maybe they're just asking for something different. And so the answer, I guess what troubles me, and I want to come back to more of the details in a moment, is that we always just seem to be just behind in our response. The Americans really stepped it up this week with more money and funds to help pay for the Ukrainian government bureaucracy and those kinds of things, certainly more equipment. We're there. The deputy prime minister announcing that we think after some performance art this week that the Russians should really be thrown out of G20 and these other groups. Why are we being so reluctant on this?
I think there's a few things. I mean, I think one, just on the artillery piece, I think is a great example where there is a significant need to make sure that we do coordinate this. So the Americans, as part of the package that just discussed, that was announced this week, are committing now. I think the totals now is going to be 90 pieces of American artillery that they're going to send, as well as a commitment to train the Ukrainians from, they have people trained on their own piece of artillery equipment. If it is an M777, I'm not an artillery expert by any means,
Yeah.
but it's a fairly significant different piece of kit, more modern technology. And so it wouldn't make a ton of sense for Canada to donate 4 pieces of artillery that were different than the 90 the Americans were going to send if the Americans are sending 90 and training people on how to use them. So
Right.
we can, in some cases, it doesn't really make much sense to move faster than the pace of the wider set of efforts if we're trying to kind of get the biggest bang for what we could send, pun intended,
Yeah.
by sending something that would complement what other people are doing. So there's that. I think the other thing is that, this is all a pretty novel exercise. I mean, Canada is not, I can't recall an analogous period where we've been going through the inventory literally like this and looking for things to send overseas. So there's a whole set of bureaucratic processes being launched here. They don't have a ton of a template. We did end up sending some of the equipment early on, several weeks ago, that we had originally bought to send to the Kurds when we were supporting the Kurdish forces in the Middle East, that we had bought for that purpose and didn't end up sending. So, but we haven't really done this before. I guess in fairness to the folks working on this, like for the pace of government, this is moving lightning quick. It's just set against a conflict where we're seeing, unfortunately, unfold in real time, some really devastating consequences of any, slight delay, and getting them that kind of equipment.
I mean, that's, I think, what I'm asking, which is, I understand how complicated this is, and we do not have a lot of stuff in the back room to send. But the too little, too late approach to this, or I'll just say too little. We also seem to be just coming in. Are we giving Ukrainians false hope? I guess that's it. They keep asking, they keep begging, they keep pleading. We keep showing up with some stuff. I mean, we, the West, a little late, but the body count is so huge.
It is. I think that at this point, though, it's huge in both ways. I mean, I don't actually know that we have a very good sense of what the body count for the Ukrainian forces themselves are versus the Ukrainian civilian population, which is, you're seeing that tragedy in explicit detail. But the Russians are paying a very heavy price, and a disproportionate one to this point in time. So, I think if we were to get in a time machine, it'd be fascinating to know where we would be today if last fall Western countries had made an indication that if the Russians, no kidding, rolled into the country the way that we saw them do on February 24th. I mean, the West collectively has given an astounding amount of military assistance to Ukraine in the last 2 months. And particularly if you set that against commitments across multiple governments, including ours last fall, that we weren't going to give lethal assistance. So we provide the optical sight on a sniper rifle, but not the gun. A distinction which is like a little peculiar for me. But it would be interesting to know whether or not the Russians would have thought differently, number one, about going in at all, if they'd known they'd be facing 15 or 20,000 pieces of anti-tank and anti-armor and anti-air weaponry, which they have and which has been used to devastating effect. And it'd also be interesting to know whether or not, if the Ukrainians had all of that on day one, whether or not the Russians would have even gotten to the point where they are now, potentially seizing Mariupol, and inflicting the damage that they've done. So I guess it's a little hard for me to kind of rationalize all of that. But there has been a massive change in terms of what not just Canada, but a lot of our core allies have been willing to do, and that's changed dramatically just in 4 or 5 months.
So is it because politicians have to react because people are watching this on their television screens every night? Or has there been a change in our psychology? I mean, Joe Biden at the beginning was, there will never be an American boot on the ground and there will never be a plane in the air. That's on the former, probably not technically true, because they are there training, but now we've come around. So is it political pressure, or did we just not take Putin seriously?
I think that we probably didn't take Putin as literally as we should have, in terms of, I don't think, if you go back and check against some of the statements, that what he's doing is all that surprising given what he said.
No, exactly.
I think we just collectively had a very difficult time accepting that he actually meant what he was saying, and that he would be in the process of slaughtering multiple thousands of Russian-speaking Ukrainians to do what he said he would do. So I think that's part of it, and I think many Western governments have been reacting to for the it is, I think, also important to keep in mind, or at least helpful for me to keep in mind, that we haven't seen something like this in Europe play out this way in years on this scale, on this terms of the broadcast accessibility, the social media age. So it's not just you have all the 24/7 cable news networks covering this, but the fact that Ukraine's a developed society, so everybody's got a smartphone and they've kept their cell networks operational, means that we're watching this play out, in live, in real time on social media accounts. So the accessibility and the visibility of the things that are happening, and an incredibly effective effort by Ukraine to get their message and their story out. I think most politicians would be having a heck of a time, saying comprehensively no to any of that pressure.
Zelensky is such a powerful communicator. I guess what surprises me is why. I mean, if the Russians can supposedly shut down US elections, or at least change the outcomes, why are they letting this happen? Why is Zelensky still talking, being allowed to be seen in the West? Why are they allowing Ukrainians to talk to one another and the Western media? Presumably they could shut this down.
I don't actually know that. I think my assumption would be, if they could, they'd be doing their darndest to make sure it doesn't happen. I think there's a couple things here. I mean, Ukraine has sort of been the test bed for Russian cyber meddling for years. So if anybody knows how to anticipate and respond to the type of activities that Russia does in this space, it would be Ukraine, because they've endured a ton of it. So I think there's probably some serious experience there, as well as likely Western assistance that's maybe not getting as much oxygen as the bullets and the bombs we're sending, but some cyber help, some intelligence support. I think there's quite clearly been a lot of intelligence support to help Ukraine make sure that the bombs and the bullets that they're getting end up in the right spot. So there's a lot of I think, active assistance that's happening right now. Several Western countries, including Canada, Britain, the United States, we spent several years since the invasion of Crimea in 2014 training the Ukrainian forces, which were pretty significant to start with. And I think we're seeing now just a really remarkable reflection of what a country that, for all the reasons they had to, took its security and defense excuse me, quite seriously, through having a wide population that they could mobilize quickly and put into a service of the nation defending itself. Ukraine had a pretty sophisticated set of tech sectors, and relatively speaking, so they have a lot of capacity in this area. So I think, just to go back to your question, I mean, I think if the Russians could have turned off the cell networks there and actually not had them come on, that they would have done it by now. And I think you can take it away that just as they can't gain control of the skies, and that they're having a lot of difficulty doing what they would otherwise try to do against the Ukrainian conventional forces, that they're not omnipotent. They can't just have free control of what they want to do.
The Ukrainians have been, and I've had this conversation, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, but this notion, and I think we've appeased our own guilt or concern a little bit in the West, because we didn't respond after 2014 the way we should have, and we didn't put stuff on the ground before Putin moved. But this notion that is both true and maybe a little bit of an excuse for us is that the Ukrainians have just been profoundly powerful. And they are so committed and they are so strong that they are resisting in ways that I think few other countries could. But that also doesn't mean that we were right to wait.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We've had a lot of experience doing foreign military training, including with Ukraine. And I think, the experience doing that has been very uneven. It's hard to attribute, specifically what the Ukrainians are doing directly to Canadian or American or British training, but If you were to look at the different forces that we have tried to help and professionalize and increase their capacity in the last, say, 20 years, the output from Ukraine has been, to this point in time, dramatically exceeded expectations, where I think in
Right.
most of the other circumstances, it's been the reverse, that when it actually came time to see what the impact of the equipment and that training actually meant when tested on the battlefield, we've been disappointed previously by, I think, most of those efforts in a way
Well,
that
we
we've
saw
been
that in
shocked.
Afghanistan, that you're dealing with an uneducated population, so you couldn't give them written instructions on how to clean a gun or load a gun, whereas Ukrainians are highly educated.
Absolutely, a highly educated country, a highly educated industrial country that
Yeah.
had advanced manufacturing. So I'm not sure that we fully had that kind of wrapped around the qualitative difference that would make in a country that was, not as large and not as militarily well equipped as the Russians were, but very large country geographically, had standing armed forces of a couple 100,000 people, and then because of the intentional plan to have a potentially mobilizable population, both in terms of formal reserves as well as giving, basic training for Ukrainians and firearms and those types of things. They had an enormous base to draw on relatively quickly in a way that a lot of other places on the planet would not. And you're doing that with people they're highly educated, and so I think it's an interesting indicator because of those experiences, like you're saying, where the training hasn't gone so well. It can be, as we're seeing right now, dramatically effective if you actually are willing to do it, and then also supply them, I think, in the way that we have.
And they've got some hard ass militias that have taken up the fight too.
Absolutely. Some of them that certainly seem to have some inclinations that aren't. There's some asymmetry there in terms of the hard assness of those militias, but they've definitely been, I think, fairly effective on the battlefield.
I want to touch on a couple of issues. Our soldiers, the ones that have been in Latvia, and now the ones that we have sent in the last 10 days or so, young guys from the men and women from the Army, what are they doing? What are they supposed to be doing there?
Basically two things. Bolstering the defense of NATO countries and the alliance for at large, to have more people on the ground so that if anything does happen, that they're able to respond and they're already there. We don't have to deploy them to try and bolster the defensive capability that's already there. But I think more importantly, it's to send the message to the Russians that they shouldn't consider doing anything that we then have to defend. So it's fundamentally about deterring Russia from taking any steps against any of those countries, and making clear that the alliance is committed to defending the collective security of all allies, and really putting some of our own human capital on the ground to backstop the Article 5 commitments.
So do we have to, I mean, it's 100 and some people into Poland at this point. So we may just have to keep ramping that up. If that doesn't work, then send 500, and we're leaving ourselves room to do that.
Yeah, I think we are. And again, it's the kind of thing, we're doing this as part of the wider NATO effort. So it's how much does our, whatever the head count is now, I think it's up towards 700 or 800 people, or somewhere around there, with the potential commitment that could go up to some of the higher NATO commitments that we've got of, 3,500-ish troops in total. But it's a series of commitments. But the Americans have sent people. Our other allies are sending people and equipment. So it's part of that wider alliance response.
Still, the one problem that keeps getting raised is that Europe, and despite their promises to do something about this, as soon as they can, we're still putting $1 billion into Putin's hands every day for Europe to buy energy, oil and gas. They're completely dependent. Mr. Biden allowed the pipeline to go ahead between Germany and Russia. Like, this is still a huge issue because we're not able to meet the need.
No, and I think that certainly in Ottawa, talking to folks from different European countries, there's a huge interest in trying to get off that supply of oil and gas for the countries that are dependent on it. not just because Russia is the exporter, but also because a lot of the infrastructure to get it, it's reliant on the pipelines that are there, and they don't have as much capacity as they would want to be able to bring things in through other means. But if Canada could get its collective act together, I think there'd be some strong receptivity right now to trying to help Europe diversify off that oil and gas supply, which has both created the strategic dependency, but is also, keeping the Russians solvent, and one of the few ways that they have to bring in, export.
To raise cash and
absolutely.
Yeah. The other issue where we could be helpful because of the huge Ukrainian diaspora in this country, I think the number's up to 5 million plus Ukrainians are out of their homes, out of their cities, out of their communities. This is separate and apart from those who have lost their lives. What is your sense of that? Again, we promised to send planes. We haven't yet. We saw that same issue in Afghanistan. And is that the right thing to be doing? Should we be getting some transport planes over there? Or do you think the need is not quite what we may think it is here on this end?
I think it's a different type of need than it was in Afghanistan. I mean, it's the people that have left Ukraine. I mean, in the full set of numbers, you see different estimates. I think it's closer to 10 million. Something like a quarter or a fifth of Ukraine's population is displaced to some extent.
Yeah.
5 million outside of the country, and depending on where the numbers sit, multiple millions just in Poland alone. You can still get in and out of that region by just the general commercial air market, right? If you can get out of Ukraine, especially, there's air service through those eastern countries. So I don't think the actual aircraft itself is necessarily the key issue there. I think the bigger issue seems to be about whether or not those people that are potentially eligible to come to Canada under the unique arrangements we're making can actually do so. Recognizing that they might not have left in circumstances that led them to have all the documents you would need and all that type of thing. So I think that it seems to be more like less of a transportation issue than more of a procedural bureaucratic one about whether or not they can get the paperwork sorted out so they could come to Canada if that's what they want to do.
But that's the other thing we do is we have 1-800 numbers at Foreign Affairs. I mean, honestly, can't we figure out a different system?
I think one lesson that we should take away, even just from the last 12 months, is that Canada has a reflexive policy mechanism it invokes whenever you see an international crisis, which I think for good reason, that we pick a number of people we're willing to accept and bring to Canada as a way of alleviating that human suffering. But I don't think that we necessarily have, we say that we're going to do that, but then we don't seem to have enough resources and process set up in a way to quickly actually make that benefit people that are looking to find a safer place to go. And I think the other thing that we could do right now is I'm assuming this is imposing an incredible burden on Poland and some of the other smaller countries. You can't just expect millions of people to show up on your doorstep. They all have to be housed, fed, all those types of things. Depending on how this goes, you're going to be looking at, education, all those types of issues. So there's probably a lot that we could be doing just to help the other people closer to the problem that have got huge numbers of people that have unexpectedly shown up in their countries. Yeah,
like sending ATCO trailers or who knows what, right? We just, right. But I think that's something we should focus on. The Russian warning the test of the ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic missile. Do we care? Was that just a show? Does it mean anything?
I don't know that one particular missile means that much, but I do think that we should be, in a context where, I guess, to go back to the comment earlier, who would really expect that the Russians, we didn't seem to actually believe that the Russians would be in a position where they are slaughtering thousands of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. I think we have not taken as seriously as we should the potential that Russia would do other things, which we have kind of discounted by virtue of our lack of urgency and action, that they would do other things militarily that would potentially threaten Canada. So I think the signal we should take from that missile test and the other statements from Putin and other Russian leaders is that we should move forward in strengthening the defense of North America. So NORAD modernization. I wouldn't take that missile particularly as necessarily a key threat, but it should drive home the point that we need to get going for real on modernizing the defense of North America, because the Russians do maintain the same modernized long-range forces, whether or not it's that missile or another one, where they can strike targets in North America. And I think that we've seen that we need to be a little bit more open-minded to considering that they're willing to do things that we don't think make any sense in ways that would negatively impact Canadian interests.
I mean, they penetrate our skies in the north 4 or 5 times a week, if not every day.
It's been a little fascinating that we haven't seen much reporting on that, because if you go back to Crimea, right around the time, the invasion of Crimea and thereafter, when Canada was responding quite forcefully and condemning that, we were seeing a whole bunch of strategic signaling by Russian planes flying into North American or towards North American airspace to kind of signal strategic intent. Haven't seen reporting about that happening now, but I'd be shocked if it wasn't happening.
Yeah, I think it is. It just happens all the time that's one of their mechanisms. So you've had a chance to look at the announcements in the budget, the new spending. Even in the budget, we're not coming close to 2% for our NATO commitments. We're targeting 1.5. Military procurement, as you know better than most, takes a long time. We can spend $5 billion tomorrow, but you're not going to see anything for years. So are you encouraged? Is it something? Is it not firm enough? How are you reacting to the proposed new spending?
So I'd say a couple of things. One is, had this been announced February 23rd, without any of the discussions that had happened in the last couple of months, I think it would have been received as a pleasant surprise. There's a lot of different needs that defense has. The continental defense piece, NORAD modernization I was just talking about, is one of those. So had this money been committed February 23rd, the day before the Russians invaded, I think it would have gotten a very different reception. That was another incremental boost to the defense budget that has come from the Liberal government, most of them quietly. And the budget actually did an interesting job of spelling out that since they published their defense policies in 2017, the government has kicked in now close to another $20 billion in additional money, most of it, though, coming prior to the budget a few weeks ago. We've been in a different discussion space, though, both in Canada, I think, and the rest of the NATO alliance since February 24th. And you've seen a lot of much stronger commitments, hard targets, spending targets. And, to be fair, right now, Germany has said that they're going to spend 2% and said they're going to spend 100 billion euros, but,
we'll see.
We haven't actually, we're going to have to check against the delivery there. But we haven't yet done that. And there was some expectations set by the government ahead of the budget that we were considering options for potentially either meeting or exceeding that 2% of GDP target that we have with our other NATO allies. And certainly that the budget from a few weeks ago isn't going to get us there. And I think that's it puts us as an outlier amongst a lot of our allies. I was in the federal budget lockup, and I did a quick, just Google Deep searching on this. I found 12 other commitments from NATO allies that were also towards the back of the pack, as it were, in terms of the spending as a share of GDP, that have made a commitment to increase spending. Not all of them to get to 2%, but 8 of them to get to or exceed 2%. So Canada's going to be a little bit more isolated than we were at those next meetings, because we keep making the operational commitments, and that's traditionally been Canada's refrain, that we may not be doing the spending. To be fair, as a share of GDP, we are still the 6th largest spender on defense in the NATO alliance in terms of absolute dollars. But because we're rich, it's a much smaller fraction of our economy than a lot of other allies. And I think it's going to make for some interesting discussions at the next NATO meetings, because Canada's a little bit of an outlier in having not really made even a firm commitment to spend more. There's more money in the budget, but it's between a 3% and an 8% increase over time if it happens.
There's a lot of this kind of being said, less so by the media here, but in other countries, which is the Americans have a meeting and we're not on the phone, we're not on the Zoom call, that some of the allies, I think, have just said, okay, you're sort of a bit player on this. Is that, I mean, that seems to be who we are, or as the Minister of Foreign Affairs said, we're a convener of meetings that nobody needs to have right now. We actually need action, not just convene more meetings.
Well, just on the convening piece, I think we've underinvested in our diplomatic capacity for years too. So
Absolutely.
I would love for what the minister had said to be more true. And I think one of the things that would help that is if we actually started reinvesting in our diplomatic as well as our development capacity more meaningfully. So, I don't think it should just be a defense conversation specifically, but more generally about Canada being more serious and putting more capacity, more resources towards our international presence writ large, so that we could get back to actually being conveners if we wanted to do that. But you need to have the talented people to be able to do that more effectively, I think.
And bodies on the ground, not just shut the door is every time there's a problem. Yeah.
Absolutely. And more bodies on the ground in more places, fewer people that are, posted to one country and theoretically representing our interests, and lots of other places, which is, I think practically speaking, pretty tough to do. But, that I do think that we are facing a different dynamic right now, where a lot of our other allies are taking a very different approach. And what I think one of the things that we've seen in the last sort of year and a bit is that traditional allies within the Four or Five Eyes community on some of the leading edge components of conflict now, submarines, hypersonic missiles, electronic warfare, quantum computing, they are forming smaller groups than they potentially would have in the past amongst the countries that they think have an interest in those areas and have something meaningful to contribute. And I think the kind of the most charitable way of looking at what's evolved in that is that to this point in time, there hasn't been a view that Canada had something to contribute in those spaces.
You're being very diplomatic, aren't you?
Well, if we're, if we don't want to have nuclear submarines, that's one thing.
No, exactly.
I guess it's another, though, to have the Five Eyes naval community in a subsurface environment, so submarines, be a club from which us in New Zealand aren't a part of anymore.
Yeah.
Even if we don't want to have a nuclear submarine, it's not it's a suboptimal situation to have your closest allies be dealing with things, talking about things, and you have got no insight or ability to access what's happening. And these are some pretty critical and key components of modern warfare.
I just want to stay on the diplomatic side for a moment, because we mentioned at the top that Chrystia Freeland, who I know takes this issue very seriously, this is her heritage and her roots, but we're spending endless time at the UN making speeches. I think Bob Rae's been very powerful in terms of his statements, but Russia is still a permanent member of the Security Council and can veto anything it wants at the UN. We've been talking about their membership in G20 since 2014 in the invasion of Crimea. And just now we're saying, well, we don't think they should get to be part of the club. We've let them host Olympics. Do we just really have to buckle down in this instead of sort of saying, oh, we're going to put some controls on oligarch accounts, and then they come back and say, oh, we're going to sanction Canadian senators and premiers? It's a little bit of a badge of honor, but it means nothing, right? It's not significant. Do we have to maybe lead one of those fights about pushing the Russians permanently and seriously out of these international organizations? Because we have to do something, and that's something we could say.
Yeah, I think to be fair, I think the government has been fairly strident and has been leading. Certainly our ambassador in the UN has not been a shrinking violet on this issue.
Sure.
And the deputy prime minister's language and our finance minister's capacity and the budget speech, pretty unusual in a budget speech to have the kind of stark picture painted about the fact that I think she used the term that Putin need to be vanquished, right? I mean, so seen that, and I think that we've played a very prominent role in some of these financial measures. I think, though, to your point, to go back to we collectively, including Canada, but not just us, let this slide way too long and to way too significant an extent after 2014. And we effectively let the Russians get away with it. And I think, the couple impacts of that, one is that they were led to emboldened to think that they could do things without real serious consequences. And to go back to the conversation about energy, which they're still selling in large quantities to some countries, they weren't wrong about that. I think the other thing now that, to really send a message that we do genuinely, no kidding, consider this to be intolerable and unacceptable, the bar to actually take that action is higher now. So you have to send a stronger and more consistent signal that these things are unacceptable and we won't tolerate them. And, we've been doing a reasonably good job of that for a couple of months, but it's something that I think you have to make stick for longer, and, not cave on, some of these other things about whether or not they're going to have special carve outs and considerations for some people that, would potentially affect Canadian interests, or other Western interests. And I think one thing the government, should do is, I'm not sure that we've been as clear about, is, there are business interests and other types of commercial, cultural, sporting interests that are going to be really seriously impacted by cutting the Russians out from these kinds of things. I haven't really seen a whole lot of effort at, potentially compensating people that had planned to, host a Russian hockey team, or businesses that with significant capital investments in, say, the Russian energy sector. It'd be good to make sure that people delivering on what the government's trying to encourage them to do don't, bear the responsibility personally or organizationally.
No,
for
I mean, they're
delivering on
big
that.
investors in a lot of interests here, energy and agricultural, certainly in my part of the country. But that's what we have to do. I mean, if it's going to have an impact here, then we compensate. We don't shrink away from making the decision. Yeah. Is there one thing, I mean, I know this is an area that you think about all of the time. Is there something in these long list of ideas that we've talked about here that you think would be important for us to do, that would change the way we're seen by our allies, and that might actually have an impact in Russia? Is there something we could do, be it symbolic or be it real?
I think one thing that a lot of people would look to see from Canada would be an indication that we can be as serious and act with the same degree of ingenuity, urgency about defense and security writ large as we are about the defense and security of Ukraine. We've put a lot of effort into responding, and at least in government terms, very quickly, and with doing some pretty innovative things and doing it pretty fast. Haven't seen as much of that get broadened to the general defense and security of Canada. The government's committed to do another policy review, and said it was going to do it swiftly, and I hope that happens. And swift is not just in the eye of the beholder, but actually it gets done and gets done quickly. But I think as part of doing that, other countries would be looking to Canada to make more of an indication that we are going to take defense and security and our international presence writ large more seriously than we have in the past. And sending a signal there, I think, would be important. You could do that in a lot of different ways. Lots of other countries have been doing that by announcing targets for defense spending. Again, for my money, we should be doing it across kind of the different components of our international policy engagement, not just defense, but diplomacy, upping our aid budget, but to indicate that we're going to be more serious than we've let other people think we have been in recent years.
I mean, bottom line, we need to walk the talk.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any problem with what the government has been saying about Ukraine, as an example, and some of the other commitments to upholding the international order. It's more about whether or not we are putting the resources, human, financial, and otherwise, into actually delivering on that kind of a strong rhetoric.
David, you're so calm and you're so thoughtful on this. I'm glad there are people like you pushing, both publicly and privately to see that we do stand up. We have a long-standing relationship and reputation in this country from our involvement in earlier wars, and I think we need to preserve that part of our self-image.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. David Perry, president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. teaches at the Center for Military and Strategic Studies, the University of Calgary, and hosts a podcast if you're interested on all these matters defense, called Defense Deconstructed. And he is the go-to guy on these issues, which is why we went to him. So thank you. Thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate your time.
No, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, great. That is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin.